just a second. So welcome to our next iteration of Birch Bark Editing's In Conversation series. We are so excited to have Amy Butcher and Brendan Jones with us tonight, something different from our usual group of people, and just a wonderful opportunity to hear from some people who are inspired by Alaska and have great stories to tell. If you're interested in helping keep these conversations going, we do have a little donate button on our website. Otherwise, let's just get right into this part where we're going to meet Amy and Brendan. I'm going to give you a little information about each of them, and then we'll start with Brendan reading from his book, Whispering Alaska. So our featured author is Amy Butcher. She is an award-winning essayist and the author of Mothertrucker, Finding Joy on the Loneliest Road in America. It's a book that interrogates the realities of female fear, abusive relationships, and America's quiet epidemic of intimate partner violence set against the geography of remote northern Alaska. The book earned critical praise from Publishers Weekly, Kirkus Reviews, The Wall Street Journal, Good Morning America, CBS News, the Chicago Review of Books, the Oxford Review of Books, Booklist, and others. Amy earned her MFA from the University of Iowa's Nonfiction writing program and is the director of creative writing and an associate professor of English at Ohio Wesleyan University. She lives in Ohio with her 3 rescue dogs, beautiful beasts. And you can see in the chat where you can visit Amy's website and also a link for purchasing Mothertrucker. Brendan Jones. Born in Colorado, raised in Philadelphia, Brendan Jones attended Columbia and Oxford universities. He has been a MacDowell Fellow as well as a resident at the Anderson Center, Caldera, and Ragdale. He worked 11 years as general contractor, starting Green Saw Design and Build, guiding Pennsylvania's first LEED platinum reconstruction. He continues to carpenter and commercial fish in Alaska and also teaches philosophy and creative writing at University of Alaska, Roots Technical University in Russia, and Stanford University, where he was a 2013 through 15 Wallace Stegner Fellow. He has published work in the New York Times, The Guardian, Washington Post, GQ, Smithsonian, Patagonia, Plowshares, Fine Woodworking, National Fisherman, Narratively, the Seattle Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Narrative Magazine, and recorded commentaries for NPR. His novel, The Alaskan Laundry, published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, won the 2017 Alaskana Prize and was longlisted for the Center of Fiction Debut Prize. He recently returned from Siberia, where he spent a year with his family as a Fulbright scholar. His novel, Whispering Alaska, published with Penguin Random House in October 2021, received a starred review from Booklist. He lives in Sitka with his wife and 3 daughters. And if you look in the chat, you can find his website and where to purchase his books. So great. I'll turn things over to you, Brendan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with Amy and with you guys. Thanks for the opportunity. What I thought I'd do is just read for about 10 minutes from Whispering Alaska. And then I guess Amy will do a short reading, then we'll chit chat and then have some questions from you guys. So I was actually just telling Amy when we got on the call here that I usually read from the beginning of the book, but I was thinking of reading from a moment when these 2 kids go into a stand of old growth. And for those of you not familiar with the Tongass, where we live, trees here can get up to be 1,000 years old. And there's this one particular stand of old growth. Amy, I'm not sure if you've been back there before, but it's way up the valley, and it's just it's hidden. It's kind of off trail, and that's kind of what I had in mind when I wrote about these 2 kids wandering off trail and finding themselves in this just wondrous glade of hemlocks and spruce. The more Cleet spoke, the more Nikki felt like she was stepping into a story she had once known and loved, but had forgotten. The same with the land. She recognized the volcano and these trees. And as she walked, she thought that she could be content living the rest of her life in the cool light of this forest, without ever seeing another piece of plastic or a computer or a cell phone again. The heady smell of sap and the power of Cleet's story filled her with both strength and awe in the same way the Presbyterian church back in Danville once had, with its vaulted ceilings and purple stained glass windows. When Cleet stopped ahead of her, she was so deep in her thoughts, imagining the woman in white putting on her jewelry, that she almost ran into him. He poked a pile of green mush with a stick. "You have any songs you like to sing?" he asked. "Because it sure looks to me like that is some fresh poop." Her heart ebbed in her chest. The feeling of peace and wonder evaporated. "That pile was as big as a funnel cake." "That looks really big," she said. "Big poop, big animal." That's also what Shashquan would say. A soft wind moved through the bramble. Above her, a branch creaked. "The bear went over the volcano," Nikki started, and then she caught herself as Cleet laughed. "Sorry, how about row, row, row your boat?" He nodded and joined in, and the two of them bellowing out the song as they walked. The trail swung back to the river. When they reached the water, Cleet led the way up a series of yellow stumps arranged in steps. They crossed to the halfway point of the cedar, the log flexing beneath their weight. Cleet stopped and poured tea from his thermos, holding a steaming cup out to her. The hot liquid warmed her chest. He sipped and stared into the current. Nikki thought he was going to tell her another story. Instead, he said, "It's kind of silly, isn't it, having children and then swimming off?" And as he spoke, what she had thought were rocks below transformed into hundreds of salmon. Cleet's eyes slid toward her. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "Why?" Nikki said, focusing on the fish below. "I mean, with your mother." His eyes shined. "That wasn't nice. Also what I said earlier." He continued to watch her as if he didn't believe what she was thinking. "I wish I had known her, my aunt," he said. "Mom said she was really smart, like really smart." Nikki didn't know how to respond. After a moment, Cleet screwed the thermos back on. "Just a little farther," he said. The heart-shaped leaves shook back and forth in the breeze, as if taunting her. "This is so silly," she thought, as she was about to go on. "These thorns and talking trees and grizzly bears." And on top of that, she had never lied to her father about being away. If he found out, he'd never treat her the same again. Trust was a big deal. Josie was one thing. She had always gone her own way, dyeing her hair in the sink at the RV park or whatever. But Nikki was never dishonest. She knew he depended on her even more now. The wind coursed through the branches, pushing at her back. She thought of the view from her window, the old yellow cedar standing high above the other trees. And then of the medicine man dressed for trouble and the woman in white deerskins. She looked down at her gloves and took a deep breath. With her elbows protecting her face, she flung herself forward, gritting her teeth against the thorns as they tore at her wrists. She closed her eyes, trying to push aside the pain. Her boots squelched into the mud. The leaves parted and Cleet stood there waiting. "Okay," he said, staring forward. "Okay," she confirmed. They crossed a small stream running through the moss and climbed to an open expanse of grass pocked with small brown puddles. Miniature trees draped with aqua-colored lichen grew up from the soil, which flexed with each of their steps. "This is a muskeg," Cleek told her, as he pulled a few strands of lichen from the branches and put them into his pocket. "This is called Old Man's Beard, always good to have for fire starter. That and sap from a Sitka spruce." Ahead of her, she heard a branch snap, and she froze, sure that a bear was going to lunge from the leaves. Cleet's head turned to the fringe of the muskeg just as a brown shape rose from the brush, charging away from them. Cleet exhaled, smiling back. "Blacktail." We startled him. "Would your dad have shot it?" she asked, trying to calm her thudding heart. "Probably," Cleet said. "In August, you can only take bucks. He was a forky, a smaller one." They climbed a hill of trees, separating the lower muskeg from the higher one, which was longer and wider. Networks of black mud trails pocked with deer hoof tracks wove through the grass. The sun emerged, lighting up the gnarled trees growing from the swamp, which Cleet called dwarf pines. Her extra tuft sunk into the spongy soil. It moved ahead of her like a wave. Water bugs skated along the surface of the silty brown puddles. "Almost there," Cleet called out. Even as she saw the thick block of trees ahead of her, it was difficult to imagine how some of the world's tallest, oldest trees could emerge from this forest. The dwarf pines, which Cleet said could be hundreds of years old, were short and twisted. She moved up to where he waited at the edge of the muskeg. He had removed his can of bear spray from its holster. We need to hurry if we're going to make it back by dinner. Luckily, the sun's breaking out, but that could just be a sucker hole. What's a sucker hole? She asked. He smiled. For suckers who think it's about to get sunny. Oh, ready? He asked. She didn't move. Her legs wouldn't budge. Nikki, Cleet said slowly, are you okay? She nodded. Actually, being out here, it's just a lot of feeling. I understand. It's just if town votes to cut these trees, we might never see any of this again. Not the muskeg or the dwarf pines. This might be our last chance, okay? Okay. Then he disappeared into the bushes. She shut her eyes and took a deep breath. She brought her elbows to her face and pushed through. When she opened her eyes again, she saw in front of her hundreds of the tallest, straightest, most beautiful trees she had ever imagined. Clusters of ferns grew around their bases, the fronds dotted with raindrops. Mist shifted through the branches, furred with moss, making wreaths around the bark. Below, lush hills of moss rose and fell like waves beneath the behemoths. Cleet pointed toward a group of gray-trunked trees, growing upward like long waterfalls tumbling from the sky. The guardsmen, he whispered. A drop of rain fell on the back of her hand, sending the smallest of currents through her palm up her wrist. She pushed a few curls, damp from the drizzle, behind her ears. They must be taller than skyscrapers, she said. I can't even see the tops. Shh, Cleet said. Nikki stood still, letting the kaleidoscope of trees resolve in front of her. One by one, the trunks separated, as if introducing themselves. They took on individual characteristics, a crooked branch here, moss draped like a pair of pants drying over there. The trees grew on such a different scale from the black walnut or even the Norway spruces on Uncle Max's farm. Behind the three guardsmen, a wall of brown rose, and then her eyes put together the puzzle of moss-heavy branches, attaching them to the same trunk. It was one entire tree, she realized, thick as a row home in downtown Danville. That's the old yellow cedar, Cleet said, older than America, probably older than the Renaissance. The needles were the color of the ocean and sprayed out in feathery plumes. It's amazing, Nikki said. It will be one of the first trees to go because it's so valuable. Her ears picked out not only the rush of the creek and the uneven warbling of a bird, but a faint hum rising from the soil. The green pieces of paper, or numbers on a computer screen, could be exchanged for these living pillars pushing up from the lush moss. It baffled her. She lifted her chin, focusing on a raven hopping along a thick trunk that had fallen over the river. Water rushed beneath. She smelled something rich and sweet, similar to the mulch her mother poured into the window boxes in Danville. The smell of death and life blended together, the beginning and the end captured in a single scent. And I will stop there. And I think pass the baton on to Amy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. I think this is actually the first time I've heard it aloud. We had, for those who don't know, our books came out roughly the same time, I think within a week of each other. So it's really wonderful to get to hear that aloud. Thank you. And I also just want to thank Maxie Jane and Kat for having us. Thank you to Birchbark Editing. And thank you to Brendan for joining me in for reading. It's really a pleasure and so great to see you and your sweet family. I'm going to jump around a little bit here. I've been reading roughly from the same general passages, and so I thought I'd switch it up a little bit. And if time is on my side, I think I might have a section that I think will dovetail very nicely with your funnel cake sized poop. So we'll have a segue tonight with that, or a connection. I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the opening of this particular book. And I think the only thing, no, I don't think you need to know anything. I'll just dive right in. So this is from chapter 1. It is only in the Columbus, Ohio airport a few weeks later, buffered by the sweet smell of Auntie Anne's and the particular fluorescence of industrial lighting, that I allow myself to consider what a ludicrous thing it is that I am doing. I am flying clear across the country to meet a woman I met on the internet, an Alaskan I've discovered on Instagram, an Arctic ice road trucker who goes by the handle Mothertrucker. Despite my obsession, she is still mostly a stranger, no different from the men and women who idle beside me in the John Glenn Airport, coveting their premier spots beside the outlet chargers, or trying to secure their 10,000 steps, or complaining loudly about standby wait lists to smiling customer service representatives who have been trained to excel in empathy. I too am trying to excel in empathy. I think this sense of openness, this sense of understanding will help when I meet Joy, when we are alone in the cocoon of her truck cab for what Joy tells me will be 14 hours minimum, but could easily expand to 48, depending, Joy says, on the weather or other truckers or the Sag River, or even the road itself. The James W. Dalton Highway is the most dangerous road in America. 414 miles of gravel and occasional pavement that extends north from Fairbanks, Alaska to the industrial town of Deadhorse and the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay. More drivers die on that road annually than anywhere else in our America, in no small part because its miles are subjected to the worst of Mother Nature. It is built on desolate, remote terrain that often gets washed out or slicked with ice or glazed so thoroughly by late spring snow that the path ahead disappears, obscuring what is ground and what is air, what is road and what is tundra, and in that difference, sometimes a life. The truth is, I had been looking for a savior, and Joy Mothertrucker came to me like a dream through the well-lit lens of Instagram. Each photo another door that at night I'd escaped down and through. Joy is an Instagram celebrity, though she'd never call herself that. They just like my photos, she told me the first time we spoke. I found her account one wintry evening while scrolling innocuously past photos of perfectly plated pasta and beautiful children with sleepy cowlicks, well-designed white living rooms, and handsome golden doodles. Freshly 50 with the face of Kate McKinnon and a body like an exclamation mark, compact, lean, and somehow commanding the world's attention, Joy is the nation's only female ice road trucker, a woman who has built a life driving big rigs on the James W. Dalton Highway and documenting its beauty, rare and natural, snow-glazed and blue. Joy calls that cold place heaven. She says the highway is downright holy. She seems like God to me. And while my itinerary may bridge the divide that separates two strangers, brings our two very different worlds together, as the airport terminal fills with people, I am forced to confront the fact that all I know of Joy is a series of stark bullet points I have shaped into character. I know, for example, that she is petite with long brown hair and looks like the kind of person who would make a very fine rustic soup, something with potatoes and red lentils, stewed kale, and the half moons of carrots. I know that she has a 17-year-old daughter, Samantha, and is decades deep into her second marriage. I know her family lives outside of Fairbanks on a plot of wilderness with a mule and at least one horse and more dogs that I can keep track of in a cabin her family built together after the first cabin they built burned down. Joy told me they chose the plot of land for its isolation and spectacular views. And in the photos that she has sent me are occasional dispatches over the past 2 weeks since I placed my phone call and then purchased my ticket. Her mule is teething against its bridle before a forest glazed slick with snow. A Samoyed puppy, a cloud of white, is bounding across a pasture, its paws stained green from grass. Joy's 18-wheeler shines in the driveway, freshly washed and waxed, a handsome blue. It is in this truck that Joy undergoes her transformation, becoming a little less Joy Ruth Wiebe and a little more Mothertrucker, a name her son Daniel suggested as an Instagram handle, but that became in time a lived persona followed by over 11,000 Instagram users. I have imagined much about Joy, but I know her highway better. The James W. Dalton Highway is the longest stretch of serviceless road in North America and a geographical landmark that has been documented at length, thank God, in books and on the internet, in television and in film. According to my sources, Wikipedia primarily, but also Alaska's Bureau of Land Management, alaska.org, the New York Times, and the very sexy dangerousroads.org, it has been called, quote, the most dangerous road in America, and quote, the most isolated road in America, and what I am most interested in, quote, the loneliest road in North America. But to Joy, it is God's country. His land is what she calls it. Because you feel him when you are here, she told me the first time we spoke, and you're not beholden to any man. So I'm going to move forward a little bit, only to say that for me in starting this book, I really was just thinking about this book as Joy's story. I had come off of a first book that was a memoir. It was really intimate, very personal, required a lot of vulnerability, and I did not want to have that experience again. It's a little, it's stressful. And so I really was thinking about this book as sort of like my fierce, female trucker book. And really saw no aspect of my own personal story in the larger narrative. If I was writing about strong women, I didn't really see my place in it. But I'm going to read here a little bit moving forward about how I think my personal narrative came into what I'm kind of considering this like hybrid work that is both profile and, oddly enough, memoir. So this is from the middle of the book. I guess the only thing you need to know is we've just started out on the Dalton Highway together. Joy and I have only traveled 8 miles, but already things feel different, foreign, as if this part of Alaska is part of another America entirely. I am the wild and lucky recipient of Joy's impossible generosity. And when she looks at me and laughs, I feel something warm inside of me, like an animal tight and burrowed. We climb back in the truck and Joy points just up the road where men's deaths begin to announce themselves with frequency. She points and tells me that Handlebar was crushed by a pipe at this shallow pass just beyond Graveyard. It sounds like you're playing Clue, I say. It does sound like that, she admits, and then she rattles off some more names. Mustache spun out around Gobbler's Knob, and Elixir died after a medical emergency caused him to crash his snowplow near Oh Shit Corner. She tells me Donut was one of the lucky ones. He survived after being buried alive in a sudden avalanche as he was descending Adigan Pass last winter. There was low visibility, she explains, so crews had to search for him via grid formation, charting with unique precision the endless expanse of snow-white earth. This area, Joy says, sucking at her teeth, it's not like the rest of Alaska. Here, storms come up so quick, so fast, and suddenly you can't see anything. I think of how much of life is like that, good until it isn't. Outside the window, there's another cross. I think about it a lot, Joy says, how they all thought that they were getting home that night. Elixir and Mustache and Handlebar, Buck and Spud and Cactus Jack, getting home to their wife or to their children or to a heaping plate of chicken pot pie, to linen stretched over a tabletop, a tumbler of milk neatly sweating, to Jeopardy or the evening news. It makes her a better driver, Joy tells me, a better member of this community. She releases a squeeze of windshield fluid and pivots the wipers from side to side. She tells me these men didn't expect to die, to go through their windshields, to collide head-on with another truck, to be crushed or burned or smashed. I listen, scared to be beside her. That much should be obvious, but it's a different kind of fear than the fear I have felt for years. Which is to say, quite simply, that I do not fear Joy's company. And I think the last section I'm going to read from is very short, but I think it's the first passage that I wrote in trying to weave my own narrative. And in many ways, I think my own narrative was the impetus of writing this book. I think a lot of times writers might pretend that they're very interested in something else, and I think that's a genuine interest. But there's also sort of an underlying motivator there. And so this was the first passage that I wrote in which I started to envision my own role in the story and my own narrative. And so I'm just going to read from that. The only thing you need to know is that for the sake of the book, Dave is my partner back home in Ohio. That fall, Dave built me bookshelves and cleaved log coffee tables and tree limb disc coasters with rings and years you could count. Time made tangible like his gifts. But the first time that he screamed at me, I cowered in our tent behind the red rocks of Mesa Verde and the Colorado desert that stretched beyond. It was our first vacation together, our first time out of Ohio since he had moved there, and the first time that I worried about his anger. I found myself initially mesmerized, as if another person had entered his body. I could not believe that this was Dave. But my fascination gave way and quickly to reality. I was a woman in a desert sharing a small space with a man in rage. That night, I lay awake perfectly still, trying to determine if he was finally sleeping, trying hard not to make noise. Never in my life have I made myself so small, a bird burrowed in the bushes. The campfire still smoldered just outside the tiny mesh flap, but we had both become someone else. When finally the tent swelled with the morning heat, it was as if night had taken the terror with it, folded it inside the sky with the rest of the evening's darkness. He turned to me, apologized. I don't know what he said I was thinking. It's a fluke, I told myself. I wish I could go to that girl in the desert. I wish I could tell her it was not a fluke. What happened in Colorado happened too in New Mexico and Oklahoma, and on return visits to California. And it began to happen with increasing frequency in our small home in central Ohio, where we were just beginning to build our life. Picture our planters overrun with basil, our pantry boasting his local honey, our red plastic Adirondack chairs for conversation in the backyard beneath the bedroom window, where on hot nights he would rage at me. I think I'm going to stop there, which means I don't get to talk poop, but that's a gem for another night.
I was really hoping to get the connection with my bear poop and the funnel cake, and see how you were going to add on to that conversation. Amy, I'm just always struck by how much space you open up for reflection, and kind of how you do that with physical objects, or even food like chicken pot pies, or windshield wiper fluid, or these red Adirondack chairs. That stuff I think does such work for you, and gosh, you just are able to get so much in such a small space. So yeah, I kind of had forgotten about that with your writing. And yeah, maybe I can just kind of kick it off a little bit. This the simultaneous act of profile and memoir seems at first glance kind of in juxtaposition, but I guess I'm just kind of curious, and you touched on it when you were in your reading, but how kind of the roadmap of when you realized that you were going to be writing memoir as well as profile, and kind of what that looked like. And was it kind of like your time with Joy, was it a steady realization, or kind of maybe you can walk me or walk us through it?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, thanks. You're all also just such a close reader, so lovely. And listener, so thank you. Yeah, I mean, I initially, I went up, I think one of the things I'm very aware of is that what I ultimately attempted to do with this book is to write about a character that I spent in totality, about a week with. And that's no easy feat. I think when I initially conceived of this book, as I mentioned, I really saw this as a profile of Joy. I wanted to understand who she was. I wanted to understand why this job that, consistently placed her at such great risk. What was it specifically? She was really spiritual. And so the refrain that I continued to hear from her was that this was a place where she felt closest to her God, where she felt closest to her spirituality. I wanted to know why that was. And for me as a writer, that contrast of this is where I feel closest to God, and yet this is also the closest that I had brought my body really to harm. And again, consistently, she was someone who drove this highway 2 to 3 times weekly for 13 years. So that's no small feat. And so I really envisioned this first trip up to Alaska and on the Dalton Highway with Joy to be the first of many. I think that I thought, like any good writer, you have to spend a significant amount of time with your subject. And so again, it really was the first of what I thought would be many trips with her. I wanted to see the road specifically in different seasons. We completed our journey together in April of 2018. And when I flew home, there was a plan that we maintained all summer that I would fly back in September or October to do the highway, the journey again with her in a different season. As a writer, I was always thinking about conflating these trips, very likely visiting again in winter. And so, that really was the plan. Unfortunately, reality had a very different plan, in the sense that I think if I'm writing about a subject who has made a living, navigating the deadliest road in America, as much as I was interested in that danger, it's also the danger that ultimately took her. And so when Joy passed, it was, and I'm not spoiling anything, this is really the first page of the book lays this out, because I didn't want in any way this to feel like a narrative trick, right? As a writer, I'm trying very hard to be ethical and to handle really sensitive conversations the best I can. And so I wanted to lay out from the very first page that Joy passes on this road. And so we did our trip in April of 2018. Joy passed in August of 2018, just, 4 months later, and about a month before I was set to come back. So at that point, it was clear that I would not have the opportunity to do multiple trips. I had been given essentially a week. And I think initially that was really challenging for me to think about committing to this larger project. But I also knew from our conversations in the truck cab, as a writer, I'm trained to ask, those continual questions of why, not unlike a toddler. And so, when we're talking about what it was about this job that appealed to her, there was the spirituality aspect, but there was also that this was a job that afforded her a way of livelihood and a financial independence that was important to her because she had been in an abusive first marriage and was gradually revealed in a second marriage that had been abusive throughout its duration. And so I knew from those conversations and from my own experience, very privately navigating what was happening in my own home, that was fodder to potentially open up the project. And for all the ways in which I think we saw ourselves as different, we spoke this common language of what it was to feel afraid of our own home. And so that became, I think, for me, the impetus to writing my own story alongside it. And in terms of practicality, it also, I think, lent itself in the sense that I had a week's worth of material I really wanted to embody on the page. But that was really it. And, I think, again, there was this element of Joy's faith that she was absolutely certain that, I think 4 or 5 times in the week that we spent together, she reiterated, like, you've been brought here to tell my story. You're going to tell my story. And I, as someone who was not raised with faith, I sort of would smile and smirk and think, I'm just a writer. That's all it is. But I do think that there was an element that I know I benefited enormously from meeting Joy. And I do feel very lucky that I get to bring Joy to life on the page. Although I never imagined that it would be under these particular circumstances. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's funny because you're talking about objects in my work. And, as I'm reading, I'm trying to think, as I've spent, summers in Alaska, but I only know it under the guise of I'm there for a couple weeks at a time in June and July. And in your reading, I made note of so many of these beautiful Alaskan intricacies, right? Salmon, certainly, but also musket, old man's beard, Sitka spruce, yellow cedar, sucker hole, among others. So I guess I'm wondering, in what ways did you find yourself, as you're writing, sort of readjusting your focus to try to convey Alaska to people who haven't been there, who, how did you kind of pick and choose which elements felt important to bring to life? The richness, I think, of the description as you're describing the wilderness and the flora and the fauna of Alaska is really palatable, or palpable rather. So just thinking about how you're embodying not only writing sort of this young adult novel, but also trying to bring Alaska to life for people who might not have ever been there.
Yeah. First off, I think that you did spend some time here in the winter and you stayed on our tugboat and it was very cold.
Briefly, but I don't think 2 weeks, in a harbor gives me credence to talk about Alaska year round.
You get pretty good cred for doing that out on the tugboat. Yeah, in a weird way, I think it's almost easier with kiddos than with adults, because adults are kind of constantly fact checking you and saying that that tree doesn't live that old, or that's the wrong generis for that, and kids are just so open and they're so eager, and you can really just throw anything at them, and it goes back to learning language. They have this incredible ability to synthesize I actually have, I think, a friend on here, Mariah Kamenstein. I went to Montessori school in Philadelphia, and of course, Maria Montessori, she was very into projects, and you kind of pick one project and you do that project and then you put it away, and that's kind of how I was raised. But for that moment, you really focus on trying to, understand what's going on with these manipulatives, with these things in front of you. And so kind of a long way to answer to say that, I felt like these kids would really get the forest. And it wasn't as difficult as it would be with adults to really kind of bring the forest home, especially old growth forest, because I think it's kind of all there for us. And then, as I kind of mentioned in my reading, computers and cell phones and daily life kind of takes us away from it. But kids are much closer to it than I think adults. They have, fewer obstacles between them and these kind of natural worlds. So it was a relief to be able to write for middle schoolers and young adults. And it seems like, and I also have three kids, 3 girls. So if anything I felt wasn't working, I'd read it to them. And as soon as, their little eyes started to wander, I'd kind of make a little tick in the manuscript and go back and give that a little rewrite. So they were really good little canaries in the coal mine. But I also wanted to ask you kind of a question along the same lines. Alaska is a huge part of your life, and clearly from this book and just knowing you teaching at Sitka Fine Arts. And I guess what role the state, or not really even the state, but just the land up here and the weather and the people played for you in allowing you to find the courage to just jump on the plane and just kind of have this crazy blind date with Joy. And then also, more importantly, kind of have the courage to reach back and try and figure out what was going on between you and Dave, and whether, I guess, the sense of adventure or just kind of diving in that's so kind of prevalent in the state, and even kind of like the attitude of improvising and making stuff work, how that might have helped or been instrumental in your writing of the book, Mothertrucker.
Yeah, that's great questions. I would say, for me, I think it largely started as a place of fear or anxiety, because as you know, Alaskans are very territorial about works around Alaska, right? And so for me I'm an outsider. I had spent 10 summers in Alaska, in southeastern Alaska. I had absolutely stayed on the tug and kind of jumped around a little bit, but I was really nervous, to be honest, about writing about Alaska from an outsider point of view. And specifically, I didn't want to contribute to what I was told was a trope about, coming to Alaska as an outsider and being saved by Alaska, by the wilderness, by the land. All of that was true. I think to step off a plane in Alaska is to immediately, I think, fall in love with it. You and I have had many conversations about, what would it look like if I were to move up to Alaska, because it is the place where I love living, I think, the most. But I was really nervous because I wanted to do justice to Joy. I didn't want to fall, to that trope about Alaska healing me. And I think, especially, to speak frankly, one of the things I was concerned about was, at the end of the day, Joy and I, 2 very different women, very different experiences with intimate partner violence. I was never married. There are a lot of differences between us, just generally speaking. But at the end of the day, Joy and I are 2 white women, and we're bumping around in a truck in northern Arctic Alaska, in this land that has been industrialized and built up. And we're, talking about domestic violence. But also, I think for me, just very cognizant of the fact that there are these populations in Alaska, and I'm speaking specifically to women of color and Indigenous women as well, who, regularly see the highest rates of domestic violence overwhelmingly, and are less likely to have access to resources, to ever see justice, sort of that sort of thing. So I think that ultimately that anxiety that I felt was really important in guiding the work, because I wanted to open it up in the sense that, for the book's purposes, I'm more or less coming to Alaska with an open mind. I mentioned that I had taught at the camp, but I really didn't want to belabor the point that I had spent significant time in southeastern Alaska, because it was so very different up on the Dalton Highway. It was so very different, me and Joy. And I think to that point, I wanted the impetus to be not necessarily the land, but Joy herself. And that was a conversation that she and I had on the trip. As I think all along I had submitted to this idea that I'm doing this, badass sort of daredevil thing, riding this highway with this truck driver, going up to Prudhoe Bay, kicking around up there. And I think for the sake of the book, and to some extent for me as a writer, I'm thinking like, this is the journey, this is the natural, narrative arc. This is the climax, is being on this road and being changed by this landscape. But there was actually a very frank conversation that Joy and I had, where she said something like, you're looking at this trip to change you, but like, you've got to take the steps. You've got to start to put distance between you and this relationship. And I think, all the more after Joy passed, I felt that I had this responsibility both to Joy and then also to a reader, not to fall down that easy sort of rabbit hole of coming to this place changed me, because I really think that more than anything, it was the conversation that unfolded with Joy, and that could have happened really anywhere. I was doing an interview recently, and the interviewer said something about a Susan Orlean quote, where she said, if you want to get a really rich interview with a subject, put them in a car and drive somewhere. And I hadn't heard that quote. And I started laughing because it's absolutely true for me. So that's sort of a roundabout answer, but I think addresses sort of what you're talking about specifically. And I'm curious, certainly you've mentioned the 3 kiddos. I'm curious, as an enormous fan of your work and having read, your novel, having read all of the wonderful essays and pieces that you've done. Specifically, I'm thinking you had a piece in Patagonia with a title that I absolutely love, which is Trees Do Better Standing Up. Right. And so I'm wondering, how did you, writing about the Tongass for adults, right? You have this piece in Patagonia among many others. How did you come to Whispering Alaska and this decision that like, I specifically want to write to what I'm guessing to be like a middle school age, right? What was that decision like for you, that you wanted to specifically write young adult and you wanted to engage this younger audience?
It was a pretty simple one, feeding the 3 mouths on the table. The agent actually pitched it to me through the editor, Beverly Harwitz at Random House, and she had this vision of twins going to Alaska, and she wanted to, I guess, after reading Alaskan Laundry, she wanted to know if I was interested in writing it, and I never really thought in any version of my life that I would be writing any sort of middle grade or young adult, but that ended up happening. And it was a great pleasure because the book is dedicated to my 3 daughters, and I did a lot of, had a lot of time just to imagine what they would be like as older kids and what they'd be experiencing, and also allowed me to kind of see the world through their eyes, just open to everything, like I was saying before. So yeah.
I wonder if this is a good time to start thinking about the questions that people have for you also coming in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Actually, so Tom Keating had a couple questions, and I feel like if I do this right, I can put them together and get to the question that I also had selfishly. So both of you, if you can hang on to these ideas, one of them is about basically craft, and do you take a lot of notes? So Brendan, when you're in the forest, are you specifically taking notes? Are you working from memory? And Amy, I had that question the entire time I was reading Mothertrucker. And then the second one has to do with fear, and did you feel fear while you were on the highway, Amy? But I wanted to extend that to both Brendan and Amy, in that both of your books and the excerpts you read from dealt in fear, and there's stereotypes about what Alaska is and what it can be like. And do you think that setting helps you discuss this important emotion? And something clearly big was happening between Cleet and your narrator. And so can you talk a little bit about how the setting of Alaska does that while addressing craft and notes and all of that together, please?
Brendan, you want to kick it off?
I'll answer the notes one. You can answer the fear one.
Okay, the notes one's easy for me. I mean, I think everybody has a different idea about how to go about doing this best. I consider myself an essayist and not a journalist, which is a funny distinction for someone who's not affiliated in the writing world or familiar. But what I'm trying to do when I set out to write is to write a true story that is also artful and creative, and really embodies that idea of an immersive experience. So it also is nice because I'm off the hook a little bit in terms of the fact checker and that element. I'm not a journalist. I don't need, sound bites, that sort of thing. For me personally, it's really important that my writing obviously be a verifiable, sort of truthful account. But what I've learned in the last 10 years or so of writing about other people, interviewing people, is that you would think that you get the best possible, most accurate version of something if you whip out a tape recorder, if you're jotting notes down the whole time. And it's actually the opposite. It really is the second that you take something out, an instrument to record, people clam up, they turn into an altogether different version of themselves. I'm a professor here in Ohio, and I constantly have students coming up to me, writing for the student paper, asking if I'll give a statement, and I say, yeah, sure. And the second that they whip out their tape recorder or their phone, suddenly I'm like very aware of my professional role, of the way that I sound. I'm anxious about wanting to sound smart. I mean, all of these things that come into play. So when I was writing about Joy, I was really transparent that I was writing about her. I was writing about the highway. And so, we're sitting in the truck, and I'm jotting down notes, and I do that largely on my phone. I like the way that it looks like I'm texting, when in fact I'm sort of just playing with sentences and jotting things down. So I didn't record many of our conversations, although I do have pretty ample, videos of the landscape where you can hear Joy talking sort of over that, like voiceover. But I have found in my writing that for the most part, I jot things down as I'm talking to someone. I jot down thoughts. And then generally speaking, when I'm drafting material, once it gets to the final state, I then send it to that person and ask them to sort of go through. And if there's anything I got wrong, please let me know. We can have a conversation. But that really was the method that I used in Mothertrucker. And again, because I had no idea that this was the first and only trip that we would have together, I really wasn't that concerned. And so that became a little bit of a challenge, in that I recorded a lot of notes, but it's something like, 8 or 9 pages, single spaced. But at times it's like I had to go back, and she kind of talked in a way that was cyclical. And so it was a real process for me going through my notes and trying to figure out at times like when thoughts would connect. But that's just sort of my own experience. And again, I feel lucky in the sense that I'm not, nobody's reading Mothertrucker as a guidebook to go up the Dalton Highway. It really is about sort of other things. So that's at least addressing that first question. What about you, Brendan? How do you find that you kind of take notes and make those observations?
A lot of, at least the feature writing that I do, it's difficult. I mean, I was just, for that GQ piece I was doing, the Mint 400, so I was in a stock VW for 300 miles bouncing around the Mojave Desert. So I mean, I literally I couldn't. What I do when I'm with other folks, like what I did with the co-driver there, is I just kind of tell them beforehand that after we're done with this thing, we have to sit down together and each tell a story. And if I'm lucky, then I'll have them, just like you were saying, Amy, write their story down on the phone and then just email it to me. And I'm always struck at the differences between their story and my story. And then I ask them if I can plagiarize their story and take what I want. And usually, since they're not, getting paid to write a 3,500 word article, they say yes, because they don't really care. And then I just, like a little magpie, just kind of pick and choose whatever I want. And that really helps me kind of get into it and figure out what I want to write about and what's attractive. So definitely notes in the phone, but I really rely on other people to kind of, maybe it's laziness, but kind of do my work for me. And that's kind of the deal we have going in. And then just to real quick pick up on the second part of that question, I first came to Alaska when I was 19, and for a bunch of reasons was just kind of, I moved into the woods. I lived there for 8 months. I built myself a hut. I burned down my hut, when it was time to go back to Columbia University, I said, forget it. I'm going, west. And I went to China and Vietnam, and I got really sick in India. I mean, I just wanted to put myself, for some reason I haven't entirely figured out, through the ringer. And through that process, I think I realized, after living some time back on the East Coast and in the Midwest, that Alaska is the only kind of space where I felt like I could kind of be constantly on the edge, but also safe, and at least safe enough to, raise a family and kids and everything. And so, I mean, fear, I think, is certainly part of everything that I end up writing about, but also just that very thin membrane between fear and just absolute joy. And maybe it's kind of a constant practice I have of, right when I'm starting to feel anxious. And there's a moment in the GQ article where I get super claustrophobic, just trying to kind of play a trick and say, well, can you feel as happy as you can feel anxious right now? In Alaska kind of makes that happen for me. What about you, Amy?
Yeah, I would echo that. It's funny, Brendan, I didn't tell you this, but I taught actually one of your essays about raising babies and dodging storms on the tugboat today in my class in Ohio. And you actually end with a line that my students quite liked, which is, never did I think that I'd teach my daughter to fear, something to that extent. Yeah, I didn't. I taught it today. And they really liked it because it's something of a moment of epiphany. You can find this piece, I think it was on Narrative or Narratively, the journal.
Narratively, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, all that to say, yeah, I mean, I think for me, this was a heavy book in a lot of ways. I like to use the verb seduce when I'm writing about something. I try to seduce the reader into caring. So nobody really wants to pick up a book and read about domestic violence, about intimate partner violence as epidemic in this country. So it is a little bit of a trick, right? In calling a book Mothertrucker, in saying it's about Alaska, it's about, truck driving, it's about this dangerous highway. I really wanted to kind of like convince a reader to come in and then kind of engage this larger conversation. That said, like, I didn't want the book to just be really heavy. Joy was incredible and she was funny. And she really subverted my expectations in every way. I mean, I joke about the Instant Pot and the vegan meals that she's like popping on the road. I mean, this is not a McDonald's, truck driver. This is someone who's taking online learning classes about her diet. And that was really interesting to me. And I didn't get to the poop passage, but there's a moment, a story that she told me on the journey specifically about pooping on this highway where there are no rest stops, there's no shoulder, there's no nothing. And so how do you stop and go to the bathroom when there's no, travel stop or something? So as much as possible, I wanted the book to engage with lightness because as Brendan said, The Alaska as I Know It is one where, yeah, there's this ever-present sense of danger, right? There are so many ways, specifically on this highway, that one can lose their life, but there's also, for joy, this incredible joy, this sense of spirituality, this sense of beauty and purpose. And the road itself presented all kinds of unique problems that I wanted to pay attention to too. So again, I think just that tricky balance of trying to cover a range of emotions and feelings.
Oh, wow. That's really great, both of you. Thank you for addressing both those questions. Matt Armstrong, and we only just have a couple short minutes left. So just if you could think shortly, this one's for Amy. And he was asking, when you were considering your genre, was there a precedent? When you're conflating profile and memoir, did you find any other books that were like that? And what was your greatest challenge in doing that hybrid form?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the books that immediately come to mind. So I teach an essay by John Jeremiah Sullivan called Upon This Rock, which is so great and so lovely, where John Jeremiah Sullivan goes to Creation Fest, which is this Christian music festival. And he kind of profiles the experience, and you think you're getting one thing, and then he pulls out sort of his own experience of faith about halfway through, maybe 2/3 of the way through the essay. And I love that piece. I loved it. And I teach it, every couple of years. I'm also thinking there was a really amazing book called Throne by a writer, Carrie Howley, in which she profiles MMA fighters. in the Midwest. And it's a really interesting book because she has a fictionalized narrator. Carrie Howley herself is a writing professor. She's married, she has 2 small children, but on the page, her narrator is a woman by the name of Kit, who is a philosophy graduate student who doesn't have children, who doesn't ever want to get married, who really is kind of cynical. And it's an interesting book in the sense that it engages that conversation of how all of our narrators are in some way fabrications, because we're always picking and choosing what elements of ourselves to play up, to dismiss. We're sort of, again, amplifying certain characteristics depending on the piece that we're writing. So I wasn't ballsy enough to create an entirely fictitious narrator, and I didn't need to, I don't think, but that was a book I was thinking about. There's another beautiful book, Demon Camp by Jennifer Percy, which profiles a man who has returned from the Afghanistan war and is struggling with PTSD. And goes down to a really fundamentalist exorcism camp in this place called Portal, Georgia, where they perceive PTSD to be a demon. And she undergoes the exorcism as well when they tell her that she has a demon inside of her. And so again, these books that are doing this, for me, this very interesting thing of profiling something and then getting really immersive about it. So those are some just immediate thoughts that I had about books that have really inspired me and made me think about, what this project could look like. Absolutely.
And Matt said that he teaches the essay too, and that Demon Camp sounds great. So I want to really thank both Brendan and Amy. You two have been just wonderful tonight. And Brendan, I can't wait to read your books. Amy, I was just lost in Mothertrucker. I loved it so much. I hope everybody will offer a big virtual round of applause for these 2 authors. And stay tuned to Birch Bark Editing. We have a couple events coming up. Please just come to our website and look at our events site, and you can see what's coming in. And please take a look at our new Microlit Almanac. If you're writing in short form, maybe that's something for you. We'd love for you to consider it. And everyone, thank you so much for coming. Good night.
Thank you so much, Maxie. Thanks, Kat. Thanks, Brendan. Good to see you, friends.
Really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Same.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.